Anyways, the main thing is that Socrates is still right, and we don't know anything. Human knowledge, maybe there's divine knowledge, like we used to say, and maybe humans have some divine knowledge. That's like what religions like to claim, and even not religions, like Socrates claim sometimes. But that's not what we're doing. In other words, if a human says that he knows on something that he knows divinely, he's lying. Because you don't know that. Whatever we call knowledge is not that. Maybe it's something else, which is fine. But that should actually cause you to claim less for yourself, because the nature of divine knowledge is not to go around claiming I know stuff, like any religious person has said since forever, like to us, right? Like the whole thing. Wow, this is a whole thing, but the whole thing I did some about this in one of the practice courses that I did. The whole real difference between religious philosophy basically in the Christian sense, but also in the Hasidic sense. I don't know about Jewish, like the medieval Muslim Jewish thinkers, but yes, meaning the Rambam and his friends totally didn't have this humility, at least was not a basis for that. I don't really call it humility, but some kind of non-knowledge. They were very certain, they were very into certainty, as well as the modern Jewish thinkers. So Jewish philosophy doesn't have this built into it, but Jewish religiosity does have it built in, I think. Well, thinking about it now. Anyways, Christian theology has it very clearly built in, and Hasidic theology has it very clearly built in. I don't know, but these are very general statements, so they're probably have to be qualified, but there's something very built in. If you read Augustine and so on, even Thomas Aquinas are very clear about the limits of humanity, limits of human knowledge, and limits of human ethics, right? The whole issue of Christianity is that we can't be good by ourselves. And that also means we can't know truth by ourselves, right? We need divine illumination or divine enlightenment even to know about God. That's the basic Augustinian position. And there's something very religious in that position. I know that all these rationalist Jews don't like Christianity. But there's something very true in it also. Because honestly, humans are whatever. Like it says in the Siddur, Siddur and so on. So for the human to go around claiming I know God is like the biggest chutzpah ever. Not only chutzpah in the sense of like being morally bad, but chutzpah in the sense of being like making a claim, writing a check you can't fulfill. And which means that, so obviously in the sense of human knowledge we don't know much. And it doubly means that in the sense of divine knowledge, you don't get to go around saying, I know. It's like one of my old jokes was to say that ani mammon is a contradiction. If there's ani, there's no mammon. If there's mammon, there's no ani. And that's why, there's no way, what I'm trying to get at is there's not a way out of the problem of human unknowledge, I don't know how you call it. Not humans not knowing anything by saying that I believe, because that would make you not know even less. Because the religious claim and the people that work with the religious claims of revelation that go beyond, which is the Christian and Hasidic position, that revelation goes beyond reason, beyond truth accessible to reason, which is again not the Muslim Jewish position. They always all understand that this leads to humans not being able to say I know God. You sort of have to say it still, so you get into all kinds of paradoxical language and things like that. It becomes into an action or an attitude, but it's an attitude of great humility. And of course, very few people internalize this, so it turns into just the opposite, where it's like, I have mystical knowledge, which is beyond all of your knowledge, it could be the biggest Balgaiva in the world, but then you don't have mystical knowledge, because the condition for mystical knowledge, or divine knowledge, is not to be Balgaiva, not to think that you know God. And yeah, some people knew this, some religious people knew this. Some people in this line of thinking knew this. That there was a just the Hasidic stories, anyways. There was a guy, a Lubavitcher guy, Pinya Korf, and he died in Corona. And one day he had a project of teaching some Satmar kids Tanya, and some Satmar Chassidim didn't like it. So they got very mad and they came to his office, or they arranged an ambush and they beat him up. Or they cut off his beard, something. Yeah. And then the Lubavitch was very mad and they called the guy to court. They actually got the guy arrested, Satmar, that beat him up. And this Pini was a Chassid. So they ended up losing the court because he was such a honest guy that he was like, I'm not sure if it's him. Anyways, but one of the things that they said was that the judge was asked the two people, like, oh, so you're religious people, or are you religious people? And the Satmar, the Tzarech, said, yeah, of course, very religious. And the Valley guys were like, that's a more religious attitude. So anyway, so since people don't know anything, so we also don't have philosophical progress for the same reason. We have this, we have some progress, but I'm not getting into that. But we don't have progress. And one of the very weird things in this modern story, people go around saying, well, now we have science, or now we have technology, or now we have this and that, is that they tend to assume, and even in very basic ways, that we know a lot more than, something in this science attitude is that we know. And by the way, you don't know. Most of the people that say this, they know nothing. They don't even know third grade science. Don't tell me we know. So what's worth it? Somewhere there's knowledge, in some encyclopedia somewhere maybe. That doesn't make you very smart. You're still a pretty dumb guy. And this is another whole thing that you have to be smart, right? It's not enough for knowledge to exist in the world. But even more than that, there's and it's like an attitude, like a basic attitude, which is a lot of things, and it's very weird, there's not an admission of ignorance. Many basic questions, even the most, we talk about the soul, right? Almost everyone, unless some people try very hard to squint and say, well, I understand everything, and there's no questions. But there's no good materialistic, or how it's called, mechanistical theory of what's called consciousness, right? The high realm of consciousness. And the general attitude, and this isn't just some people that say this explicitly, but it's also the general attitude that you get just from walking in the street, is, we don't really know how to explain it, but we will know. It's like a messianic belief. Tomorrow science is able to explain it. And you could read it's very weird, you could read people, every week there's some new computer that does more tricks or something, and people are like, wow, this is going to solve all the world's problems, or kill everyone, whichever way you like. That's just the difference of people that like to imagine Mashiach is killing everyone, and people like to imagine Mashiach healing everyone. It's a very ancient split. There's some people, even some Nevi'im, that like to imagine, the Messianic age is the end of everything. Like Midasadin. And some people like to imagine it as both. Yeshaya Novi has both of them, depending on which Yeshaya you read. But anyways, and the weird thing about all of this is that none of these things even exist. The actual things that exist, they might be useful, they might not be useful, but they don't do anything. They don't do any of the things that are claimed for them. What they have is a certain hope or a certain belief that it will happen, based on some linear progression theories or something like that. And maybe the prediction is true, maybe not, but we don't know. Even if you have very good prediction, we still don't know anything. And there's something very against this, just admitting yes, maybe, something. And that's why I can't even put myself on the other side. Maybe I should, but I can't put myself on the other side and say, well, it will never happen, because I don't know that it will never happen. The world is a lot weirder and bigger than me. So who knows? Maybe the paperclip maximizer will actually happen once. I don't know, but probably not. But maybe. Well, we have to think about it. We can think about it. Maybe it's a stupid thing to think about, but maybe not. But we don't know, and we definitely don't know that way, in that direction. And there's certain over certainty or over claiming to know that I think is not justified, and it's a whole attitude. That's why I think I like to blame it's Google's fault, but it's just the Yetzirah's fault, because people always have to claim that they know more than they do. But the attitude of wisdom and the basic attitude of philosophy is not knowing, and I keep on saying this, and I do this for real in certain classes where people arguing with me more on basic things, which is to keep on saying that I'm the weirdo that doesn't know all the things that you know, and that's why I get to ask all these questions. What is life? I'm going to talk about this. what is life? Everyone knows, right? It's not even a question that you spend 5 seconds thinking about, because you just know, right? Well, if you go to like a biology class, they might start telling you it doesn't matter. It's just another way of saying I don't care and I don't pretend that I know things that I don't know. We could talk about this thing and that thing, and we don't really know what life is. And there's something very basic, like it's a very babyish question, like what is life? Well, science figured it out. Okay, so can you tell me what they figured out? It takes a long time. Also, we don't know. Maybe I have to believe you that if I go to college for 4 years, I might know what life is. Okay, so it's all based. I'm not even talking about like the taqlid part, where it's all based on believing someone else knows, but it's also based on assuming. And that guy doesn't either know actually. If you actually ask that man, usually this is what happens. If you actually ask that guy, he said nobody knows. We don't even think of this question. We just try to think of how we can get money out of the drug company or something. Like, that's not the thing that drives us at all to know how life works. And that's the biggest. Showing that's my issue. Anyways, showing. So where are we? Yeah. What I wanted to say another drusha. I was prepared. Yeah. The question was.
So is the aspect of
Yeah, scientists are very against babyish questions. Like, we just teach you to not ask this question.
But even if things can't be characterized in their terms or their way of acting in reality.
Exactly. It's something like if you read certain like that invalid question. Why is it invalid? Just because I don't know the answer, so I don't like it. It's just like from people. Like this is the condition conscious or parrots, whatever it's called. It's not a valid question because I don't know the answer.
Yeah, they asked
it's fine.
Once, like, you don't know anything about consciousness, and it's like very interesting. You didn't know anything about decommunication either.
About?
Decommunication either.
Yeah, I don't. Maybe we do.
So, I mean, he doesn't.
No, what's
so,
the idea of that?
I respect the answer.
That we don't know.
Yeah, he says we don't know anything about decommunication or about how people interpret.
Yeah, and if you say we don't know, there's different ways of saying we don't know. There's like this whole positivist project of making we don't know into like an article of faith, that if we don't know, that means we can't know. I don't know who says.
Is that an issue of modern philosophy, or that's just an issue of
so it's a good question, but I think that I think 3 levels. I think that first, like everything else, and this is a not modern way of thinking. I think that everything is an issue of the snake that talks to Chava, whatever. Like it's all very ancient problems. Nothing like basic human fallacies. That's number 1. Number 2, I also think like Socrates, that all basic human Yetzer are philosophical positions. Which means you could explain everyone's Yetzer Hara with some very shelf of philosophy books, and like Socrates claimed that people are just making mistakes. They're not bad. There's no bad people. Or even if they are, maybe they're bad philosophers. But there's always some way to explicate it in a very sophisticated way. That's number 2. Well, the other argument is that they're just evil. Like in modern politics, that's what most people generally assume. Right? People generally assume that there's no reason to even argue. Like again, in religion, in all kinds of areas, right? We don't even argue with those people. So they're just evil, and that like explains it. It doesn't explain anything. You gotta still explain how the guy's evil, right? What mistake he's making.
Is that actually a shita? That almost just sounds like juvenile thinking.
No, it's a shita, of course. That people are just evil. Well, again, there's a philosophy behind that too. I can circle this thing. No, I think that there's of course, philosophically it comes down to the question of equation, to the question of if people actually do bad. I mean, Socrates and Aristotle and Plato were all confused about this. This is a hard thing to explain. There might be such a theory. Yeah, it's somewhat laziness and also knowing too much and so on. But I think there's such a shita. Yeah, and there's also there's also a whole like modern kind of shittas that are working with this, known as conflict theory, right? Like Marxism, which says that I understand very well why the boss wants to take more money than you because he likes money. There's no not because he thinks that he deserves it, right? Yeah, whatever. There's a whole, there's basically. And thirdly, so that's the second thing, that there's a reason for that. So there's a philosophy behind it, although people might not know it or so on. And for that, there's something interesting in modernity as time goes on. It's still modernity. Which is that more and more of those shelves of books get actually written. So that's something that we get out of living later. Like we get to read the justifications for being a Nazi. which most people, they were Nazis all the time, but they didn't write books. Well, the Nazis also wrote pretty bad books, unless you read like Heidegger and Jung, and then you might find, and what's the contemporary Nazi's name? No, he also wrote a huge box of books. The Russian guy, no? The guy with the beard. Putin's philosopher, no? He's a Nazi just for Russians, no? I forgot his name. You know who I mean? Yeah. Dugin. Alexander Dugin. So Dugin is also one of these people, and he's got a whole long shelf of books to explain why it's to Ukrainians. So that's something that we can get. We could actually read all these things if you're interested in them, to try to either be convinced to be an evil person, or to explain what's the mistake. And thirdly, this is something that I think is true, but that's more noticeable. I think that historically, even, a lot of like modern conceits, like modern science, came out of a tradition that had all these chutzpah, and they try to explain it. So while you're a scientist that you meet, or not a scientist is a bad word, like certain popular science popularizers, which are trying to make you vote for the Democratic Party or whatever, promote a certain thing, they're actually working in a certain tradition which they don't know by themselves, but which sort of said the things that lay behind the kind of stupid things that they say. So it's historically true, I think, that many stupid things that people say nowadays sort of go back to something that someone said, either some modern philosopher, and sometimes it goes back to like something that you could find in Plato's Dialogues, where someone said, and some sophists said that, so yeah. Like any kid can tell you that there's no truth, it's all relative, and there was a famous guy, Protagoras, that said that, and there's a whole dialogue to explain if man is the measure of all things or not, and if it's coherent. So these are ancient shittas, they were not invented, but yeah. I don't know where I got to this. I was saying, that was a question about that, yeah. Okay, but Kitzur Hamasa is, you wanted to know about last week. Where are we up to with the soul?
Yeah. Oh. So, sorry, let me just read this out. Right. Okay. Is it okay if I just recap it for you quickly to make sure I understand?
Yeah, no, you should do that.
Okay, so first we reiterated that the soul is not the soul as it's understood by a common term, but Aristotle has it as being the form of the body. And we discussed that even though having defined the soul as the general definition, meaning as the same way forms relate to rocks, they relate to humans. We now want to understand
in a specific way
why there's what if a human has a form or soul, then what would that thing be? I'm just trying to build up to the question. You want to find higher order principles to give explanatory.
But I'm going to fix you for. Could I stop you or?
Yeah.
The general thing is that humans' forms relate to human bodies or matter in a specific way, which rock forms don't, right?
Right, there's something proprietary.
There's the proprietary kind of relationship, not only a proprietary thing.
Yeah.
Kind of form, like there's different kinds of forms and there's living kind of forms.
Right. So we had soul, that's right, as the definition of a living thing. So, or as the form of a living body.
Exactly.
When we say something is alive, we mean to say it has either or all of the following: intellect, perception, emotion, and nutritive movement. When we say plants have movement, we mean this is only nutrition. It's to say they decay and grow. And the scheme of movement is internal to itself.
That's what makes it our natural thing.
Right. It explains procedures to be understood as nutrition, the plant life. Right, okay, so this is what I was wondering. I think I said it briefly last class, but it was just, I didn't find a definition that excludes this, but maybe that doesn't mean that. By eating, we mean that the body is utilizing something outside of it to then become part of its scheme of existence, but is that just extra information that doesn't need to be there?
Yeah, not relevant right now. I mean, it's chapter 4 or 5 or something.
That's what I was just asking. Okay, so that was really it. And then when you asked if the soul's immortal, we want to understand.
Yeah, we don't really know how we don't need to know yet how eating works. We need to know, but it's like getting into more detail, or how nutrition works.
And then, I'll just say the rest of it because just wanted to see if these notes were. When we ask if the soul is immortal, we're attempting to understand its degree and direction of contingency, which would indicate its separability. For a soul to be immortal, we need to discover that it isn't associated with the body in some way. I mean, it's not the form of the body directly.
Of the living body, of a certain kind of life of the body.
But it has to be the form of something else, right?
Well, it has to be something else. Yeah, so we're gonna run into a problem of how it relates to the rest of the body, to the rest of the forms or whatever.
And the other thing was
we're have like a year to go to get to that one.
My notes here start to take a very sideways turn when we discuss when we were talking about Plato. Plato uses like a different. This is what I didn't understand. I mean, I could read it and we're presented with the soul as the form of one thing. We are then presented with a thing that does an additional thing. Oh, sorry. And we are then presented with a thing that does an additional thing, arguing until finding out whether the faculties that they share are identical in their form, or if it's a separate form that does these things without it being a separate thing. Which is first. Yeah,
I didn't understand the words. Okay, so
yeah,
I've got a rule. I read stuff with people, but the rule is that, and I learned this rule from my father's Shabbos table. You're not allowed to read me stuff unless you know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even when you read, like read in yeshiva, they teach you to read backwards. Like read a bunch of words without knowing what it means, and then what does this? No, read the thing. It's a sentence. A sentence usually got a point to it, and then you understand what he's doing with the specific words.
Sometimes towards the end, the pace of the conversation gets faster, and
that's fine. But that's just a general.
Yeah, this part I understand.
That's why I don't ever read in my classes almost, because I think that most of you know how to read English or Hebrew or whatever, and I just after I give a class, you should be able to read supposedly the source that we're reading. And if not, that means I didn't explain anything.
This is things that I supposedly understand.
So let me try to pick up where we are, or try to see if I know where we are, and see what's going on. Okay, and we know the context, sort of, right? These the way we contextualized it last week and previous weeks is something that we have all these list of questions about the soul. Some of them like traditional questions, like the question of the immortality of the soul, question of how many parts, how many souls are there, question of is there such a thing as a soul in general. Those are one of the questions. I don't remember if we clarified this last week, but is there such a thing as a soul in general? In other words, soul as the thing that makes living things alive. Is there even such a thing, or is it just human souls and animal souls and plant souls and things like that? Is there even a general thing called that should be worthy of the term soul, right? We sort of tried to give, the first whole chapter 1 was trying to give a general definition of the soul, which would make there be such a thing as one soul, and then by implication or vice versa, you would understand that the human is also one soul and not a whole bunch of things in him. That connects to that. But these are a bunch of questions, right? There's ethical questions which relate to this, at least only halfway, because they relate to at least how we explain. So they're really philosophical, ethical questions. They're not entirely ethical questions, because almost everyone, and there's differences. So they become, I said this class once, there's slight differences that happen from the philosophy of your ethics, in other words, from your philosophy of how human action works, that turn into differences in what you should do. But in general, there is one ethical action or one way of having a good life, which everyone should agree on. And if they don't agree on it, just because they're a bad person, not because they have bad class. This is in the ethics, so in other words, like both, for example, we keep on talking about Aristotle and Plato. There's really or even more theories, but if you take these two things, both of them agree that the ultimate human good is to think, which is a separate thing. It's not really related to most of the other things that humans do. But both of them agree that what we call, or in different ways, what we call like the lower things of human life, which is like nutrition, like eating and feeling and pleasures of that, are not the things that we should pursue as a goal. They're not the good. They're not the ultimate human good. Everyone agrees with this. And Aristotle would think that if someone doesn't agree with this, it's just a messed up person. It just didn't get educated right. Didn't go to the right school. So not really much we can do about it, because we can't argue a bad person into being a good person. This is a big machlokas, of course. But Aristotle thinks that. You can't argue a bad person into being a good person. I think that reality sort of bears that out. It's very hard, at least, to argue a bad person out of his badness. You could argue a wrong person, which is, if you believe that he's really good, then we can explain how to be good. it's very hard to argue something out of being bad, because bad is not really something that's a rational thing. But even this is sort of implies or is assuming a certain theory of how human souls work, how humans work. But these are sort of things that everyone agrees on, at least the general framework of this everyone agrees on. So we're not like starting from zero here. But how do you explain this, right? How do we explain, for example, like the basic problem of people doing things they don't want to do, which is just a basic contradiction, and you should be worried about this problem. This is one of the things that only if you're a crazy philosopher that doesn't know things, you're worried by it. So of course, I want to do it, then I don't do it. Well, are you crazy? Like, I wanted to wake up. Well, you didn't want to wake up. Are you lying to me? Or you thought you wanted to, or you wanted to want. People have all kinds of... If you start asking people this question, they start giving you all kinds of weird formulations. Each one of them is like some philosopher that sort of works with that kind of thing. But you don't know what you're talking about. You basically don't know. So just say, I don't know. It's a good question. If you could accept a good question, then we could figure out, and we could figure out the philosophical answer, and maybe after we have a philosophical answer, it might have implications for action. Like maybe if we know how me wanting to wake up at a certain time and then not waking up works, I might have a way of, waking up, right? Or maybe I might learn that it wasn't a good idea to wake up at that time in the first place. Or maybe I would have to, work more in a certain direction and so on. These are, in some way, side notes, in some way like details. In general, everyone agrees that you should wake up at the right time. So that's not going to be in question over here. But why am I saying all of this? I forgot why. But because, no, this is just to explain the relevance of the question of parts of soul, which has a lot of relevance to ethics because of this question of is there one soul and many souls? So we discussed this. Like the Platonic way, and I say like the Tanya way always, is to explain this as two people in one person, just two different people fighting it out. And somehow, we end up with the question, who's the third one that decides that? And if there's a third one that can be in charge of both, and why don't we just say that he's the person and forget about these two other people? They're not relevant. That's the basic question against the Platonic position. But they have answers too. It's not like but this turns out to be mostly a way of explaining how it works. And again, on the margins, there might be differences. Like Aristotle likes to insist that external goods are good. So don't go around saying, this has to do with like the educational thing, right? And I'm trying to explain that there's much less difference than people usually think. Because, and they have this big machloikis in Hellenic philosophy. There was this big machloikis where the Aristotelians were going around saying that it's good to have a nice house. And all the Frima people, almost everyone else said that that's crazy, it's not good. And they get into like the critiques saying, well, what if you need a house to put a mezuzah? So maybe it is good, but it's not that good. The kids, Stoics have their like theory of preferred indifference, which is just contradicting terms according to most other people. But the kids said this whole machlokes is a very small machlokes, because everyone agrees that you shouldn't have a big house, or you shouldn't be busy having a big house. Shal is just philosophically it's like a good thing or a bad thing, but in practice, like there's differences on the margins, like this whole like nuzir is a chayte or a tzaddik, and everyone sort of agrees that in some instances you're a chayte, in some instances you're a tzaddik. And the difference is like really about in the philosophical description, like do we describe this as a good or do we describe it as totally relevant to the ethical question and so on. And it makes the nafkamina at the margins, but it doesn't make a real difference, I think. The way people go around saying that this is the people hate the world because they're Platonists, that's not really true. And that's what Aristotelians like saying about Platonists, that they just think God made a bad world, and some Platonists say that, so that's fine. But most of them don't. That's not the real difference. Okay, I don't know where I got this. This is a side note. Okay, point is, so now what we're trying to understand this thing with the soul's parts. And that was one of the basic questions, like how many, is there a soul? Or is there even one soul? Does it have a bunch of different parts? And stuff like that. And what we did last week was to try to work, I more or less tried to work with the order of this chapter 2 here, and try to explain I'm going to try to rethink the whole thing, because I think I more or less went in the order of his Aristotle's chapter, but it turns out that I don't really understand what I said. At least I thought about it and I don't understand what I said, which is another way of saying that I can't repeat it to you like easily. We've learned, and the Baruch Hu it says, and this is another dish that I wanted to say, that real understanding you don't forget. There's such a site from Al-Farabi. Okay, if you really understood something, you never forget it. True understanding or true knowledge. If you forget something, it means you never knew it. It's a very weird thing to say for anyone that knows human beings. Right? And the guy that said it wasn't obviously no human being, so it must have meant something. And there's like a mystical meaning to this, which is you get sexual appeal and therefore something. Okay, but there's a basic shot, I think. And the basic shot is that we're not talking about, according to our style, and Plato, by the way, according to all the ancient philosophers, you don't really know continual influence, right? It's not possible to change things. It's only possible to know the more basic things. Like, basically, you can only know God, right? Like it says in Chassidus, it says, V'yadata yem v'shloisa levecha, Hashem lekim einoid. So there's two chapters on the einoid. One chapter is einoid, there is no other God. And the other chapter is the einoid is going back from the V'yadata. There is no other knowledge. That's a position, because knowledge has to be of certain things, of really true things, and therefore you can't know anything besides for God. But not don't say God very quickly.
There's certain physical or metaphysical theories that automatically, I guess, our interpretation or perception of
So what it means, I think that because of this thing where the real knowledge is only going to be of the more basic things, the most basic ways of how things are. These are also going to be, and not like Kant would say, they're conditions for thinking. They're also conditions of things, right? Not only things. But these are the most basic ways of how the world is. Like, you never forgot. You've learned it once, by the way. You once learned object permanence when you were like 4 years old, or depending on which psychologist you believe. Maybe when you were 2 years old or 1. But you once learned that when you do this, your father doesn't disappear. You used to not know that, okay? This is a basic way of how the world works. You know, like object permanence. I think some people didn't know it, learn it that way. They like stick their head in the sand and so on. But you've once learned it. And it's a very important thing, right? It's like one of the most important things you could learn about the world. It literally takes you, whatever the experiment says, it takes you at least 18 months to figure this out. Okay, which means that people are thinking all the time. Taking in, like they're taking in information, trying to figure out how the world works, right? To figure out, like you cry and you get milk somehow, and all kinds of interesting things that you find out. And then at some point you find out that your perception doesn't create reality. Right? It's very big thought. Some people still think that it does, right? And if you're like a really big philosopher, then you go back to these object things. But most people assume that this is like one of the most basic natures of reality. Like, this is something that you should know. I'm serious. That has like really ethical, like we could really show that this has real ethical implications, and for many people live as if there's no object permanence, even if they claim to know it, right? If I don't look at my bank account, I don't have a minus, right? That's how people live. Okay, maybe. Or maybe if how does it go? If they chas v'shalom 3 times, it won't happen. Another thing. Like the Stoics are very intellect laughing at it. It's not going to change anything. Now this is a real thing that you know. See, this is a good example of real knowledge. Object permanence. You really know that. It's very hard to argue, even though philosophers that claim they don't believe in it, they really do. Like everyone, that's the famous example. Like it's a column thing, right? The answer to skeptics is to give them a slap. Very ancient theory. Which means that nobody really believes that. People might argue it and so on, but it's very hard to argue someone out of object permanence. It's also very hard to forget it. Like even in your dream, you don't really forget it. Maybe some people have like really weird dreams where they control things with their thoughts or something, but in general, you really never forget it. Even when you're senile, you basically don't forget it. This is like the one thing, or I'm not saying the one, probably more, like the basic structure of the world where you actually learned it and you never forget it. But it's not like you go around chazening, like things don't disappear when you close your eyes. That's not how it works. That's not what we mean, right? It just becomes part of the. Based on this, you reason about everything else, right? And if you're a philosopher, you go around wondering about it because you like to wonder about most things. But that's something that you learn. And I think that the real chachma of studying philosophy, or studying the basic ways of how the world works, maybe the basic ways of how you work, is to get at these kind of things. And surprisingly, a lot more things are like that than object permanence, which most people in this room seem to agree with. Things like, what are my examples always? Certain things, certain beliefs or faiths, or just unfounded beliefs that people walk around with, we can never forget because they become part of their basic ontology of how they basically view the world, and they're just not true, or they're just uncritical. Like many people seem to walk around with this belief and even many great, economists and stuff. Maybe it's also part of my philosophy. I mean, it is. It's a good example. Most people, but this is something that every kid walks around with, or many kids, smart kids, like some people, but they walk around with the belief that people only do things out of self-interest. That's like the basic explanation for human action. Why do you do something? Well, we did for no reason, so you wanted it. So you got some self-interest. We got this category, it's just a made-up category, nobody knows what it is, but something called self-interest, just a metaphysical category. For 3,000 people did philosophy without the hearing of this concept. It's the hardest and it's everything, and people just didn't need this concept to understand psychology, to understand human action. They didn't need it. It's perfectly understandable without it. And nowadays, most people just think and that's why we have a lot of tzaddikim that go around saying that the whole of Hashem, but stop being selfish, Zestler and people like that. And it's just not true. You're not selfish to begin with. Like, this whole category is fake. Selfishness is not a problem. Altruism is not a solution. All these things are fake. We're not saying they're fake. They're just not necessarily true. And the philosophy is a way to argue. There might be ways, maybe most people just assume that to be like true. There's just two ways to act. Either altruistically, which probably is incoherent, or selfishly. And this whole category is just like, if I would teach you something, it would be that this is a way of thinking about the world. It's a philosophy. It comes from, I forgot where it comes from, this theory. It comes from somewhere. You can actually trace its history and thought. And I think it was actually invented by the economists. And then Nietzsche stole it and so on. The point is, it's maybe not, but the point is it's a very new idea relatively in the history of thought. And I'm not saying it's not true, but it's not necessarily true. And it's probably not a healthy way of thinking about life, about human action.
Where does that idea break down, you would say?
Because altruism is also fake. It breaks down when you notice that this is a very weird way of deciding that everything is either one of these two things. I mean, I'm not giving this so just an example. So it breaks down when you read like people giving entire long series of human action without any reference to any of this. And we tend to read this into them. People always tend to read this in. Like you see that I'm talking about lishma, this means no. Lishma has got nothing to do with altruism. Nothing. It's a different word. It means for a purpose. Whatever. It's based on a whole different metaphysics. It doesn't have anything to do with this. But most people don't ever get to realize that because this is a basic, this is something they actually know. Or they think they know, right? Okay. Sometimes you think they know something you don't know. But they think they know that this is the basic category of human action, and therefore they never forget it. And they must necessarily read it into everything they read. And they read someone talking about lishma and shlel lishma, and they say, okay, that's what it means. No, it doesn't mean that, it means something else. Again, it might mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. And so on. So that's a good example of something that's wrong that people learn.
Is there a way to, to
argue out of this? You got to have a mystery. You have to take LSD.
On different lines, I guess.
What?
It's true about ethical and physical theories, metaphysical theories also. That people tend to assume that the lines are reality what they're doing.
Yeah, it's for everything. But it's more interesting for more basic things than those things. And of course, there's some level of you can go up the chain sort of and do this for more and more things. But the interesting way of learning something, that's why learning is very not really by like causing what someone's system is or what some text says. It's by trying to have the thoughts that they had and seeing. I can't prove you that any thought is the truth. I can tell that it could be true, which is already a very big thing. Most people think that only one thing could be true. Like, for example, I'll give you another example from St. Augustine. So Augustine says that he had this famous, very valuable thing to do, which is to write an intellectual biography. And his intellectual biography, known as the Confessions, goes through every shitta that he ever believed in. And the other person that did this was Al-Ghazali.
For a while, right?
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that, and also in his big book he does this sort of, but then he does it in a philosophical way, just not in a personal way, in the city of God. But I didn't read any of these books, I just know what they say. I read some of them. And the point is, he says, first I believe this, and I'm going to use the example. So he's not a Platonist in the end, because he's a Christian. I think the Platonists get some basic things very wrong. But he said that the Platonists taught him that there are non-bodily things, and that those things are more than bodily things, more than material things. And he thinks that this is true. Now he thinks that there's specific things that they believe in, or they think are artificial, and it's not true, and they're wrong. But this being able to move from thinking that material things are the only thing, those are the most important things, or the most real things, to thinking that they're the least real things, That's something that he learned from them, and you don't forget these. This is the kind of thing that, again, the possibility. I'm not saying that there are such things. I mean, most not contemporary people don't believe that non-physical things, non-material things are real. Right? So that's a very good example. If you want, someone would do this. Someone would do this work, or this philosophical work, right? If you read a book, and most books don't even try. This is a sad thing with modern books. They don't even try to convince you how much. Like, you should at least try. That's why if you read books of people that actually believe in something, it's really more interesting. Even if they believe in like crazy stuff. Because at least trying to convince you. If you read some professor giving you a history of philosophy, he doesn't believe in any of the things he says, he doesn't even try to get you to think that these things are reasonable or possible. And you don't get it. If someone would try, then it might be different examples, might formulate it in a backwards way, in a different way. And then you start learning things. And the things that you learn in this way, I think that you don't forget. The possibility. Like, once you, like like people go around saying this, once they've had a certain thought, you can't unthink it. You can't stop being skeptical about something. I don't think that's correct.
But the true quality of that belief, though.
It's true that it's possible. This is if you think, again,
okay.
you might make mistakes.
Okay.
It's also possible to think about human action in terms of altruism and egoism. It's just not true, but it's I don't think it's an impossible thought. Maybe it's incoherent, maybe it's possible. And the only thing that's wrong with it is the only thing that's wrong with it, and with many other systems, is that it pretends to be the only thing. The only possibility. It's not the only possibility. This is why that you, generally when you learn that you made a mistake, the correct way is not to change your mind. It's to qualify it. That's why Aristotle never says that anything is wrong. He always says anything is right in a way.
But doesn't like think that he's about his friends?
No, he doesn't. No, because he thinks, see, not because of that. People, not because he has so much amina, like he wants to synthesize everything.
He says in a very tighter way. It's like, these are friends of ours.
Yeah, but then he goes on to argue in that famous thing.
Right.
But he says, because he thinks that these people have reasons for what they're thinking. And those reasons are good. They're just incomplete. They might not have the correct terminology to think about. They might not think in the right categories. But I have to explain, according to my system, what they're thinking of. So this is why I don't believe in any of the things that I said last week. I don't only believe in them, I don't understand them. Like, I don't become part of my way of thinking. So I have to try to go very slowly, and that's why we have to go very slowly to start thinking. So I tried to do this today, but actually still there's shtickle Torah. I don't have a real mahal. But I tried to do my own, try to figure, where's my note? I tried to figure out the structure of what we're doing. So I came up with something like this, okay? Now let's try to cut up this problem in very small pieces. So we want to know some question, something like this, I frame it back to my framing, like how many souls do you have? Like if you read Dor, it says that you have 4 or 5 or 3. And if you read someone else, if you read the Ramban al Torah, we quoted this Shloikis, some people actually have 3, some people say have 1, and he's happy with both of those shittas, and so on. I don't even know what any of this means, so let's try to think of what it means, right? So I could think like this. I think our person can be one thing in a whole bunch of different ways, right? Obviously, anything we're talking about is one thing, at least in the sense that we're talking about as one thing, right? We're not assuming that we're not just making a mistake, or we talk about one human being, or one animal, or one fly. Like, by the way, a fly. I'm adding the word one, but when we say a fly, it includes the word one. Later in the slide, talking more about the oneness of everything. But it's true, because just saying a thing is saying that it's a thing, which means one thing and not a whole bunch of things that pretend to be one thing. If you're a real atomist, then you think that there's no oneness anywhere, right? This is the modern ship in general, that there are no things, there just seem to be things, right? But assuming that that's wrong, but assuming that there's such a thing as one thing, so there's some oneness in it, in the most basic sense. So it's not, so just like the most basic, most simple way in which a person or an ant or anything is a ant, right? If you say it's not an ant, it's a feet of an ant and a head of an ant and bacteria of an ant and whatever, bacteria cells, also bacteria and so on. And you're just saying there is no ants, right? It is not a ant. There's not one ant. It's a lot of things. So atoms think that there's only one atom in the ant.
Right, but there is only one atom, not that the unit is going to be.
But they think the unit is fake. What was the guy that said this? The famous pre-Socratic philosopher that invented atomism, Democritus, said, by convention there are things, right, and in reality there's only atoms. And that's what many modern physicists say. No, he doesn't hold that.
Not for his own opinion, but I'm saying is he uses.
That's what atomism means. In other words, if they're ontologically, they basically aren't anything, and there's no oneness either. Maybe the one atom, right? Maybe that's where there's one thing, and maybe. But besides the things that we're talking about, which are interesting things to understand, because atoms don't really do much. But the things that we're talking about don't exist, which is another way of saying they're not one thing. They don't exist as one thing. They exist as a collection of a bunch of things. So a human being is just a bunch of different systems somehow in one place, and therefore seems to us as one thing. But there's not one unit. Okay, so that's one way in which you could be one thing, right? You could be a bunch of things put together, which happen to just seem to be as one thing. When then that's like fake. It's not really not a real thing, and you could just be one thing. So that's already a way in which you could be one thing. Now you could be simply one thing, right? Which means you don't have parts, not made out of anything else. And that's not true for human beings, right? Obviously not. But they obviously have parts, right? Maybe God doesn't have parts or whatever. But humans definitely have parts. So they're not just one thing. There's something besides oneness in them. There's something besides just being one thing. So I already know two things about the one soul. Like it's one, but it also does have parts, at least in some way. Because humans do a bunch of different things. They do them in different times. They do them with different parts of their body, and no kind of things like that. Okay, so I understand that. So really, our question, the interesting question. So assuming that we don't have these like basic mistakes, the interesting question is in what way does it have parts? Right, it has parts. Obviously, the question is what kind of parts it has. Right.
The soul.
This is the soul. The soul is just a word for the life of the human being.
And we're assuming you demonstrated that parts already?
Well, you could look and see. I don't have to do it. Like, do you have parts? No, we didn't demonstrate. I just think that it's obvious. If you think that human being is a simple thing,
We have parts of a one thing.
yeah,
Sure
you have parts because I've got 5 fingers. That's already 5 things. Well, the soul is what humans are. That's just the way of saying the same thing. Just a different switch the word. That's why you don't use the word. But the soul is just a way of saying if there's a simple soul, then it's not what we're talking about. There might be, but it's not what we're talking about. There might be simple souls. You saw a book, The Mirror of Simple Souls by Dan's Mystic. But anyways, no. Simple. If the soul is simple, then it's not what we're talking about. What Aristotle talks about is the soul. We're talking about the soul that does all these things that humans do, that humans are. That's what his definition of the soul is. So it obviously does a bunch of different things, and it's also spread out over a bunch of space. Now we can start thinking of what kind of parts it has, or what kind of relation these parts have to each other. Right? And now we can sort of start thinking of something with parts, not something simple without. By the way, everything material has parts, right? Everything, at least in space, right? Everything that exists in space has one part in one part of space, or however you define space, and another part which is another part of space, and therefore has already spatial parts, right? At least. And if it's a human being, it has even more kind of parts than spatial parts, because it has different faculties, it does different things. Thinking is not the same thing as opining, like you said, and so on.
But this takes place by locating one part, right? I mean, there's a place that we're making that division. Let's say an arm is part of me, and I make that division where I say there's a singular arm, right? Make sense?
Unlike okay.
No, I'm saying this is not a conventional part. I mean, parts themselves.
Okay, well, there's different kinds of parts. I'm trying to see what kind of parts there could be. There's at least these 2 kinds of parts. We'll think about a human. I'm just saying he's not simple. He's obviously not simple neither spatially, because humans take up space. Again, if you think that there's a principle beyond that's simple, we're not talking about that principle. There might be such a principle, because you need something to make it into whole and so on. That would be the kind of argument. But Aristotle also might have such an argument in the end for the intellect, but that's not what we're thinking. I'm talking about whatever it is for humans to be alive, and they obviously have parts in at least 2 ways. They do more than one thing, can do more than one thing, is that way of saying? They have more than one can, and they also exist in space, so they're at least not simple, right? So now the interesting question is in what way these parts, after assuming that it does have parts, right? The soul does have parts, we'll have to ask, well, one question we could ask, and that's his language, now you could see why we could ask this question. We could ask if this is true. I could give you another way of saying that the soul doesn't have parts. Let's do something like this. This would also be a Platonic argument. You could say, well, no, you're making a mistake. You think that a human is spread out all over space and spread out all over different human things. Like there's thinking, there's eating, there's talking to you, and so on. two different things, and you're saying, well, there's one human doing all of that, so I just told you that it has some unity, some oneness, and therefore there's a human soul is a thing made out of parts. But maybe that's a wrong way of thinking. Maybe we could atomize the soul somehow, right? Maybe we could say these are a bunch of souls doing these different things. Well, would you have a bunch of souls for each part of the space of a human? No, because the Platonist wouldn't have that, because he would say that the soul isn't defined by anyways in this way. So the soul isn't really in space, but sometimes it does stay in space, and Aristotle attacks him for that. So I don't know. Point is, let's think without names. You could answer this, right? You could say no, there's not one soul which has parts. There's either two other options, right? You could have three options. You could have a simple soul, something that doesn't have parts. You could have one soul with parts, and then this is the place where I'm going to land on, because I have the shtickle for that. Or you could be a bunch of different souls. Each one, then each one.
A bunch of souls.
Exactly. That would be his argument against. That's exactly one of the reasons why he doesn't like that.
What, it expresses infinitely?
Yes, but you need something to coordinate it. Then you need a fourth soul for the Platonic three souls, and then you might as well just have that one. That's literally Aristotle's argument against one of his arguments against the three soul theory.
What's the difference between saying the souls are compound and saying there's just multiple souls that are compound?
Oh, compound in the sense of one thing that has parts means that it has oneness and it has parts, which means that the soul is a complex thing. It's not a simple thing. If you have it just not being compound, just three separate things, then you could leave this. If you want, if you're like constrained to have the soul stay simple, you could have three simple souls. And of course, you get into this question: who coordinates them? There's
last class is helpful for this.
What?
I think the last class might be helpful for this understanding. Like,
I don't remember what we did in the last class.
faculty.
I thought that I'm changing my thing. I don't know. I'm trying to think just straight, so I don't know what to do in the last class.
Does this question map one-to-one with how many parts does a human have?
Human equals soul for the purposes of this class.
You have to answer whether you could have a complex thing first.
Yeah, you have to do physics before you do the soul, of course. We're assuming physics. Yeah, you do. We decided that Adam is in this book, not in this book, in a different book. Literally, according to there was a machlokes in the order of Aristotle's books, but Hakol Moedim, that physics comes, at least to understand it, he uses concepts of physics. And he says explicitly that soul is physics. The soul is the soul, or the anima, is a weird book because it straddles physics and metaphysics, but it definitely assumes all of his physics, and probably all of his metaphysics. So you need to know physics. We can already understand there's bodies and these things. That's why we really should do physics first. But whatever. But should do a lot of things. Point is,
There's the shit, you have to start somewhere.
we did this shit already.
Yeah, we did the shit. You have to start somewhere. Yeah.
So what's the point? Yeah, so you have to be. You could be complex. What's the question? If you want. If you're an atomist, then he has argument. No, if you're an atomist, you still have to explain what the soul is, and he has told us about this in book 1 to explain why the atomist theory of the soul doesn't explain anything either. So yeah, there are specific arguments against atomic theory of soul, which would be something like, actually, atomists would say something like there's one atom with the soul. That's usually what they try to say. Yeah, whatever. We discussed this more in the Sadia classes, because Sadia Gaon seems to have an atomic theory of the soul, or doesn't ever admit that he has that theory, but Rambam claims he has the theory. So we discussed this, I think. The point is, assuming no atomism, and assuming no whatever the precise opposite of atomism is, which is Parmenides, that there's only one thing, assuming all these things are not true, and assuming whether they're doing something like Aristotle's physics, we have these kind of questions. But these, I think that we can skip there because this is common sense. Common sense is not atomism, although the science class tries to put it into your common sense, it's still not. Nobody really thinks that there's no people, or no tables, so it's still a lie. It's still not common sense, at least. Although this goes back to our other discussion about how much people believe science. Nobody believes that there's only.
What do you mean by atomism? Because everyone agrees there is a certain pattern about people. So are you saying?
Right, I mean, this is the base. This
No.
is how idealists basically go into that position.
Wait.
What he's saying is that sometimes they count for the differences then.
What do you mean by people?
Perceived, right?
No, I don't exactly understand. Basal scientists don't believe that there are such things.
Yeah.
Don't believe there's a.
No, they don't have an explanation for that. They think it's a psychological notion. That's really what they think. They don't actually think that because they're human beings. But the science doesn't think this. They literally say this, and when you ask them like for the metaphysics, that's what they say. At least there are even metaphysicians that claim this, and they call it a bundle of attributes. That's the analytic language we use. Is there's no people. There's only a bunch of. Oh, I'm going to. Okay, I wanted to say lam shir. Okay, this is lam this. Okay, so in Shulchan Aruch, you wanted to hear shir and halacha. I'll explain you. In halacha, there's halacha of kibri. Okay, you're not allowed to. How do you say lesh out? Okay. How do you say in English? Be mechaber a light, fire on Shabbos, or extinguish, or on Yom Tov, even on Yom Tov you're not allowed, correct? So on Shabbos, so now the halacha says that if you've got a big fire with a bunch of little sticks burning, and there's one stick that's not on fire yet, you're allowed to take that stick away. Okay? There's a bunch of sticks, they're not one fire. They're going to be a fire in a few minutes before your fire is going to split to the next stick. But there's a bunch of little sticks which technically, according to halacha, each of them has its own fire. And therefore, if you take away one stick, you're just moving the stick. It might be muktzah, so you then get different questions. But assuming that's not muktzah, then you're allowed to move that stick away from the fire. You're not doing anything wrong. But if you have a big cup of oil, and you take a drop of oil out of the cup, it's your over and kibbutz deraisa, and you get skila on Shabbos, and even on Yom Tov you're not allowed to do it. The reasoning behind this is because there's not a bunch of pieces of oil. There's one big cup of oil, and that's on fire. And now you're taking away fire, you're taking away fuel from the fire, but whatever, somehow it's considered extinguishing the fire. Okay? So this is a good example for a difference between atomism and non-atomism. According to this halacha, which doesn't make sense to anyone, but that's what it says in halacha, but I think that if you're Aristotelian, it does make sense. Because if you decide that for some reason, in other words, philosophically, there's more connection, there's more shaykhut between the particular droplets of oil in my oil tank, in my cup of oil, than there is between a pile of woods in my fireplace. You could sort of see that with your eyes. I mean, it's true that liquids, there's even a molecular level explanation for this. Liquids have this thing where they bind together somehow, and solid things don't do that, right? So that's true. It's even physically true. But it's also metaphysically true, right? At least for the purposes of this halacha. And this is where, unlike some people that like to say halacha just talks about phenomenology, so I don't think that's true. Halacha just assumes, no, I don't think so. Halacha just assumes realism. Just assumes that such a thing is not atomistic. There's such a thing as a ner made out of oil and fire. And as much oil as you're going to add, it's going to be one ner. It's not going to be two ners. Of course, you could separate it. That's what the kibbutz would be about, right? But then you would be breaking up something that became into one thing, and not just taking away a little part that's next to something else.
Is that any different than any other sugya with like taruvas?
Taruvas has different logics, though. Yeah, we have to think about it. I don't know. Taruvas generally doesn't. I don't know. I'm not gonna make statements. I didn't think about this. Taruvas has different gedolim. It doesn't not worried about being one thing. It's usually worried about time and generally Taruvas not worried about the thing actually existing in the thing. So that's another whole. Right.
Well, I know this is just inside, but by the oil, it's not nicker which piece of oil is burning the chlaw, but by the wood.
Right, that's because it's one thing.
Or it's just because it's impossible to discern it.
Okay,
it's not because it's one
and
thing.
Therefore.
And
that's why you would not be able to remove it. You might be removing the ignition added.
The line with the mixture, there's some line that not mixture
in Tarevus, it's called Yavesh B'Yavesh. A mixture of pieces of wood can also be Tarevus. It's the lesser Tarevus. It's Yavesh B'Yavesh.
Somewhere.
Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking.
It's bittul, but it might be a different kind of bittul, but whatever. Might be like a statistical bittul, not like a reality bittul. Meaning a bittul now knowledge, not knowledge. But I don't know. I don't know if Tarevus. What?
That's phenomenology.
No, that's something else. Okay, not phenomenology. Okay, I'm not. If you say there's two kinds of bittul b'roiv, there's one bittul b'roiv that we say that when I look, this specific one that I'm thinking is probably not non-kosher one. That's what happens by Yavesh generally, and that's why there's not a tchenas for Yavesh because it's not a real bittul. That's why Rebbe and all these prima and all these things are all Yavesh halachas. You almost never get the chad b'trei of official bittul. Because like for everything that actually says in the Mishnah, the Gemara finds a reason why it was like that. Just that is not good, because Gidden has nice and okay, whatever. And then there's different derivative, which is that the thing doesn't count anymore. Like it sort of stops existing because it became part of the other thing. But generally in the derivative, it's rationalized by the taste, whatever that exactly means, non-existent. They're not really worried about the atoms or the molecules. So that's why I don't know. At least in kashrus, it's like this, and like other things, they actually don't get buttled generally. And they do get buttled by Messiah, but I don't know. Like it's it. Sure. I don't know. I'm the chastarivas today. I learned it a long time ago. This I did look today, so I know about it. But that's an example of something existing as one thing. At least if you agree with my lamvis, or not existing as one thing. Although there's practically not such a big difference between them. I have a better example from speaking a lach example, which is different than a living thing and a non-living thing. There's a Masechtas Beitza that says, according to one Amayda, but that's halacha also, that raglia kelim, raglia meichel, raglia balam. If your food or anything is with you, then you can only stay in your Shabbos or Yom Tov, whatever. And now, if two people own one thing, and each one of them lives in a different room, so then the question is, what happens with it? So there's one question of Brera, which is a different title, but assuming even Yesh Brera, that's what they meant to even Yesh Brera and Rabbanan, at least Yesh Brera. So we don't have a problem that we didn't know yesterday, because whichever one piece we're going to take today is going to be at least was yesterday already, so that's not a bayah. But we have the Rav or Shmuel, I forgot who said that there's a difference between Chovis and Balei Chaim. So if you have a big barrel of wine owned by two different people who live in two different states, whatever, has two different Shabbos, then each one who takes his cup and moves it wherever he wants, because each one has a different piece of wine, and there's Yesh Brera, so he just split the barrel into 2 cups of wine, and then each of them belongs to whoever their owner lives. But if you have an animal and you shech Yom Tov, then although you cut up after one with that animal, you could cut up and give one guy the hand, and one guy the foot, or whatever. You can't do that. And his reasoning is that Yom Tov and other that they sort of yonik, whatever it means, in other words, and this is the machlokes and that's what it means. But the most reasonable explanation is, which also solves a bunch of problems, which you believe other explanation which Rashi has, but I'm not going into that, is that an animal can't be separated. And it's also, you can't cut up an animal. So if you have a piece of barrel of wine can be separated, although it's, like I said, if it would be a light, it wouldn't be separated. So it's different than barrel light. But it can be separated. We could say that my side of the barrel belongs to me, your side belongs to you, and these are two different things. Because they have a different kind of connection.
We assume the uniformity of the contents of the barrel, right?
No, the other way around. We assume they're different. In other words,
uniformity meaning in the...
Not because each of them is the same.
Separated.
No, not because each of them, every cup of wine is the same as every other cup of wine. Because my cup of wine belongs to me and your cup of wine belongs to you. We don't know until I take out my cup. Nobody knows. I can't show you, well, that's my side of the barrel and stuff. It is a mixture. But it's a different kind of mixture than the animal's fan and the foot being mixed together. When there's an animal, I can't even tell you that I owned the foot when it was alive and you owned the head, because living animals don't actually have separate feet and heads. That's the way I would say it. There's only one animal, because if you the way the Gemara says it, because the foot lives from the head and the head lives from the foot. Although you might, yes, be able to cut off one part and have the rest living, but it's still living along with everything else. And therefore you can't, even theoretically, right, these are all theoretical things because we're not cutting up the living animal anyway, but even theoretically you can't cut up a living animal the same way you could cut up a barrel of wine. A barrel of wine has less connection between its parts than a living...
the Magen, the cat example?
Than a living animal. I don't know about the cat, I know whatever about the cat.
The whole thing is that you could I guess files are one in a different way than mine. Like you can't just cut reality up.
Yeah, there's different ways, but there's different ways of parts of things, although both of these have parts, and they could even be owned by different people. Like Choshen Mishpat doesn't care about these things. You could definitely in Choshen Mishpat own half of an animal, even the leg of an animal, even the Uber Yerachim of the animal, and so on. But you might get into times with Urish Levala, I don't know that. But you cannot halachically you can't separate it for purposes of anything that's not money. Money has magic, it's about living things. Even that is problematic, and then, the Chetzi Shik, the Chetzi V'Skoyin, the Chetzi Evet, Chetzi V'Choyin guy, still you get into a problem because he gets stuck. But for similar reasons, right? Because humans can't actually be cut off. So humans or living things have more unity in between their parts. But they do have parts. But they wouldn't have parts, there wouldn't be this whole discussion. But they have more unity between their parts than non-living things. And I have more halachas that match with this if you want to know. Which the Lamdim think they're different, but I think that if you believe this to be the reason, they're the same. says in Sanhedrin that there's also Ida Nizachas is also Baina. And if you have the Gemara says there's a difference in Behemoth Ida Nizachas and Ifa Ida Nizachas. So when they're owned half, if the Ida Nizachas owned half of an animal, since the animal got burnt, so they got to burn the whole animal. You can't somehow take half of the animal and eat it. But if the Ida Nizachas owns half of a piece of bread or a dough, then you could just cut half and take it. And the Gemara says literally that, I don't remember the language, something that an animal can't be split and an isa could be split. Of course, the animal could be split, you just take a knife. And you just got to check it first, and that's a weird shot for that. But I think the more reasonable shot is, because Rashi from Lanzach, you have to figure out halachic reasoning. Street can't be, whatever, he has all to
talking about how to kill animal, is that what it is now?
No, we killed it. Everyone's boy, they were going to check that first. That's not bad. No, Rashi says that a shchita can't be mated because shchita is not shchita, it's hamasa. And since the Eyav Shel Ekzah is blessed with shchita, so you can't say that for me it can be shchita and for you it can be killing. So it's going to be killed and therefore whatever shechted. That's a Lomdish technical thing. But I'm over Zagul thing, I would be to say that you can't cut up animals. You could cut up everything else that's not living, you can't cut up animals. Yeah, sure. There's also Skatche Lechetzia and so on. That's also at least over there it works less, but at least in some cases you can't be makdash echatzi b'haim and pashta kedusha b'tila because and that's not true for anything that's not living. It's for sure. Anyway, so the halacha also agrees that living things have more unity than non-living things, and this is important because unlike modern way of thinking and unlike the atomistic way of thinking, which thinks that there's not really a unity in basic sense, there's really just a bunch of different systems that work in the same piece of meat or whatever, but it's not. There might still be differences, there's Eveshad Neshamat Leba and Shindla Neshamat Leba, and I'm not saying that, again, there's not saying that it's simple, I'm not saying that it has no parts, right? So there's still parts, but there is differences, even within things that have parts, there are different levels of coordination between those parts, right? Like last week we did the difference in a kigel and a salad, other differences. So we can assume this, but this is so in other words we assume that it has parts. But then the real question is this: is it like could we cut up this behemoth? Could we do the behemoth or can't we? Or in which way could we? So for halacha we know that we can't. Okay, so whatever halacha cares about, living things can't really be cut up. But how else could we cut it up? Okay, so we have to think. So, but what could we do? Also, but this is also important. So could we have? Let's ask the second question first. Could we do the third thing? Could we say that these are really three different souls? No, because again, that would cut it up too much, right? Having three different souls would cut it up too much.
Other souls to unite those three souls according to one.
For example, or there's other problems with it, but basically you would lose the unity, you would lose the connection between its parts. And we do think it's one thing, it's a thing. Where do I get this thing? Okay, so now I'm trying to think about something. What I was thinking is something like this. Now, in the most basic sense, when something has parts, it can be cut up in two different ways. And this is my way of making sense to me. We could cut it up in space, like we take one piece, like from right to left or from top to bottom, and cut it in half. That's one way of doing it. Okay? And then we would have to think what happens to it. Okay? Another way of cutting it up would be to cut it up conceptually, right? Now these two things might cause one each other or not. Like in other sense, if we see a human doing two things, could we cut up those two things and make them into a vegetable or make them into an animal and so on, right? Now, if, for example, let's connect these two things in one way at least, right? If it would be true, like Plato seems to say in one place, that the rational soul is in your head and the emotional, whatever other souls are here, so it should be true that if you cut off someone's head, then you can stop being a human, but it should still be an animal. And that's obviously not true, so Plato is wrong. At least in that sense, right? So in other words, these three souls, or these parts of the soul, whatever they are, they're not localized. They don't have places in the person. They don't exist. They're not separable in place, right? So we learned something important from the experiment of cutting up people's head and think that they don't stay animals, right? We're going to get to the worm first. I'm making my own experiment first. This is not our experiment, my own experiment. I mean, I didn't do the experiment. I didn't do the experiment. Okay. They're not. We discussed this last week, and the Ramban said that if you take the goylem and you take away his shem, then the person comes back into an animal. That was his proof that it doesn't happen. But that's only if you believe that story. And they're going to know that it's conceptually interesting that they thought that. I think so. Yeah. If you think that maybe it's true. Yeah. If you think that that's true, then yeah, I guess I'm not going to try to defend any opinions here. If you think, I don't know though how true that is. For example, if we assume, let's do some modern theory that says the front of your brain does this and the back of your brain does that, and it's not actually true, by the way. But that maybe yeah. In other words, it's less true than the simple version of that. At least the last time I read someone talking about this. But let's say it would be true that there's some neuron or some part of your brain that you could deactivate and make a person back into an animal, like with no self-control or something like that. I think, okay, that this would be an experimental question. Let's try it out and see if it actually happens. I think that doesn't actually happen that way. Or at least not clean enough for it to justify the Plato's theory. Because, do you know any people that just became animals? No, they became worse than animals. They did something very different. People become worse than animals, which means that they don't become animals. And animals are a pretty nice thing, like cat. Your cat is just does cat stuff, doesn't do anything wrong ever. Humans, could you be a bad animal?
No, I mean to say is it wouldn't. I'm not a bad animal.
A human would be
survive.
bad animal in two ways, in both in moral ways and in animal survival ways. Yeah, that's what we said last week. That humans generally can't survive without human faculties. But I don't know, again, it depends sort of how you define human faculties. We get into this question of how to cut up the powers, like cut the different things. Like if a modern person would say something like, let's say there's a faculty for self-control or something like that, executive function. And you could take that out, like with some experiment or like a lobotomy or whatever. And he still goes on living and eating and doing everything else, but he's just an animal. Yeah, maybe. I think that it does worse things to you when you do that.
Yeah,
but that would be a factual question. I don't know.
Then discern then if the operating principle of
it also doesn't entirely again. No. There's a way to make Aristotle work. In other words, he doesn't exactly say this. I'm saying what I say. Aristotle would tell you, agrees, for example, that different parts, different different organs have different functions. Right? He doesn't not know that. That's not the shaila. He just thinks that for humanity, because of the way he cuts up the functions and the faculties, that's why I have to agree with that. Because of the way he thinks, for example, he would agree that, we didn't talk about this. So, okay, it's a good question. Okay, this is a good question. I just generally don't think, and I think that in general it doesn't actually work that way. But if it could work that way, then maybe. Because humans, as vegetables, for example, well, they're like vegetables. They need someone to plant them and give them to food. But vegetables actually figure out themselves how to get food. Not literally figure out themselves, but they generally don't grow in a hospital bed, right? Like that's not what a vegetable is. A vegetable is something that comes along with its, environment to make it work. And humans, which are vegetables, don't. So they're less than vegetables. Maybe human society, they care for them, so they're powerful. I don't know. There's ways maybe you have to think about this. But anyways, assuming that doesn't happen, then we could prove from this that you can't actually cut up these different faculties into different spaces in the body. So there might be different things, but they're definitely not as different enough to exist in different parts of a person. So in every way, so my finger has some rationality in it. So it ends up happening, right? Working. Yeah, it's Aristotle's position. Yeah, 100%.
If your finger gets cut off, you don't use...
That's true. Well, first thing would be you do. There are definitely modern theories that say you do, called embedded cognitive theories. How's it called? Embodied cognition, which think that you do lose some of your rationality when you cut off your finger. Oh, you have phantom limbs and stuff, maybe to make up for that. I don't know. But they do. Is that you could. It's possible that you do. I think that this theory that our rationality exists in our head is Plato's theory. This lady has a book that is true of Plato's theory, but really the thing that it's not true. I've never finished it, but that's one of her big things. So yeah, you might just lose some of it. But also, he would tell you something more basic, which is so maybe again, not disagreeing with the reality that some parts or some organs seem to be less essential for living. If you cut off your hair, maybe your hair doesn't have any life in it or whatever. But certain things are like that. It's not this is a reality that you can't go away. We have to finish this thing. Of course, that's true. But that he would always like find what the definition of what makes the human alive as a human. Do you need the bathroom? Yeah, you know what?
That's why he
Go
asked.
straight through that door, left.
Over there, that's that left. There's a light where the light is on, and just in the corner, in the left corner. Yeah, that would be the thing with cutting it off, with the connection of the cutting off in space. But it's still true that you could cut up a human in space. But now what happens? So that's interesting. So what happens when you do cut him up in space, right? What doesn't happen is it turns into a vegetable. Right? But what does happen? So for this, I think this is where Aristotle's ant cutting off experiment comes in. Okay, so for this, Aristotle says, well, I have experiment to prove this. It doesn't work for humans. And the reason it doesn't work for humans because humans have these big organs that they need. They're complicated, complex creatures. They need organs to work. Or at least theoretically could work for humans. In other words, going back to plants, and it really starts with plants. This example, right? If you cut a plant in half, both parts at least sometimes go on living. Which means that there's a soul and there's not two souls. There's like he calls it potential, and actually I don't understand why. But he calls it means that a tree has potentially many souls, but actually only one. And if you cut it up, it will be two whole souls, or not two half souls. Right? That's the important thing. It's not half in any way, right? Because it doesn't have a place. So having a 2 pounds of soul isn't better than 1 pound, right? It's the same. It have the same definition. It does the same thing. So if you take your big tree and you cut it into two little trees, you don't get any 2 kinds of souls. You don't get even like a big tree soul and a little tree soul. There's only one tree soul. It does tree stuff. But you get these two whole souls. So, in some sense, since the soul is not two things spread out throughout the body, it's entirely in the whole body in some way. So when you cut it up, you get two whole souls. So in that you could call this like numerically potentially two. Like you could get from one per tree into two trees, but that doesn't mean that there's two souls when it's in the trees. That's why he calls it potentially two. I think I don't tell me how potential comes in, but you seem to think like you look at one tree, there's only one tree going on. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense, like we discussed. But of course, you could cut up the tree into two trees, and then you would have two whole trees. Right?
So a half soul is a soul. It's a full soul. That's this.
Exactly, a half soul spatially. Like if you cut up a tree, it's a full soul, but when it's whole, it's not two halves. It's one whole thing. And then he did the same experiment with worms, which famously some of them, or maybe lizards, some worms you could cut up into half, and they just go on doing worm stuff. And that shows that not only plant-style life can do this, also animal-style life. That's the most important thing. So with humans, it doesn't really work. He knows that. And even with worms, it doesn't always work very well, because many of those worms, some of them literally do just one way. But at least Aristotle doesn't think that they have to for this experiment to prove it, because he thinks, of course it's going to die like faster after a few minutes, but it still goes on living for a few minutes at least. And this is why people actually asked about Aristotle that humans, or even like chickens, sometimes run around without heads for a few minutes, which proves the same thing. People seriously thought this, and maybe it does. Nowadays we would say, well, it just reflex, well, reflex is living. Well, what does that mean? What's the difference between reflex and living anyways? Living means you respond to stimulus. That's what the sensitive thing means, right? According to Aristotle, that's what makes an animal. As long as you got a reflex, you're an animal. Which means that he doesn't care that you don't have a brain. I think it would prove Aristotle that the chicken's running around with other heads. What?
Why? Because the Plato
It would be a kasha, no kushkita.
Plato has to generate a new soul in that instance.
No, because Plato also matches those. I don't know how many souls chickens have according to Plato. They just have your grandfather's soul, you know, because of Gilgila. No, this has to do with this. Aristotle thinks that because Plato has souls not having anything to do with each other, so you might as well put a person's soul into a chicken. This is one of his big arguments for why that's not true. It's very backwards. Aristotle literally says that the reason Aristotle's separate souls don't work because it's absurd to put your grandfather into a chicken, and that's what follows Plato's theory. That's what happened. But it's absurd not because it sounds funny. It's absurd because it doesn't explain the chickenness of it, right? And I think the Rambam also means this one in Shemona Perukim, where he says that there's very absurd things that follow from the separate souls, different souls theory. Nobody knows what he means. I think that's one of the things he means. Okay, we discussed this already once. And what I'm trying to say is that, so I think this is what the worm cutting up experiment is trying to prove. So if you cut it up, it does get cut up, but not in a way in which you get two souls. The way you get like two parts of a soul. You get two whole souls, which just shows that the whole soul is everywhere. Right? Now, of course, the sensitive soul, just to be very clear, that's why the worms are important, because worms, at least, are animals, and we're not going to get into this today. This is another whole thing that we have to think of, which is what because he's just looking for a more general, less general definition, but the definition of animal life. Animal life, according to Aristotle, the reason is just the sense, being able to sense. And since both parts of the worm are able to sense, that gives them the full animal life, including in a human. The full animal life of a human is just being able to sense, which means that insofar as human sensing would be considered, you probably conclude that humans also. Just humans might need blood from heart for their heart for them to work, and these need the same thing for some worm. They also need their heart or whatever to work, so it's going to die at some point. But it still goes on sensing, which is the main important thing. Even for 1 minute, it's enough to prove that the sensing soul, which includes the mature soul, that's another thing we have to think about, is going to survive being caught up, which means that its soul is one in the whole body. They're not a bunch of different souls in different
There's
parts.
this lack of exhibition of this. Oh, it is. Usually, right?
What?
We never see chickens without heads achieving nutrition, right?
No, you do. It happened.
Well, they could eat?
Yeah, one time he kept his chicken alive for about a year.
By how did he feed it? Like, chop stuff into the...
Yeah.
It just doesn't have the... It's true, it's Aristotle say it just doesn't have the teeth to, like, help it catch the worm that it eats. That's why, technically, it stopped living, but it's not a real problem for the livingness of the chicken. Like this experiment proof. I don't know.
In the extreme worms, so then let's say you took 1.5 and cut it again.
Yeah.
3 cells.
Yeah, you can do it. You can go on as long as. Yeah, exactly. The point is it's continuous. Like all of Aristotle, he's not an atomist. He thinks that everything can always be cut up forever. Anything that's real can be cut up forever, at least potentially. You can't actually do it because you need a very small knife and whatever. Yeah, we're not Xeno. We could cut everything up, just potentially not actually, and that's why Xeno's paradox is not real. But that's not.
So is death just the accident of the soul just like?
No, death is when things stop being what they are. The soul doesn't go away; it just stops existing. This soul, there might be other souls. But that's the soul as a form of body just stops existing. Death is what happens to the whole of the donut when you eat it.
Right. No, I did. Like it just disappears.
Yeah.
No, it's just interesting. Like I don't know, maybe I'm just too like entrenched in modern thinking, but it's like a certain capacity, like at a certain number of times, like it has a certain number of expendable souls that it can generate.
No, it doesn't have. I don't think it has 9 souls like a cat. I don't think what he would say, because I don't know if it actually works like this, but I think some worms like this, they keep on growing. In other words, when this half worm is going to grow, and therefore it's infinite, or it's just like any species, whatever. It has the capacity to go on forever, right? Because that's part of the life of a worm to grow, and maybe it's not now; it's too small, so it's not going to be able to do whatever. Worm, maybe there's a minimum size for a worm to be a worm. I don't know, but it can grow, which means that the soulness, the can of it, which is the soul, is the can of the worm. Can, not a can. Being able to can grow, and therefore it can go on forever, as long as it's going to be the right size to be able to be cut up again.
So he's just saying that the soul is synonymous with its life capacity.
Yeah, soul is life capacity of
then
animals.
And life is sensory capacity for an animal?
Mm-hmm. Animal life is sensory capacity, yeah, sensation.
So since when you split a worm, you create 2 living things.
Yeah.
So therefore you have 2 souls.
Yeah, after you cut it. Before you have cut it, you have only 1.
And the soul is just a common form of an entity with sensory capacity?
Yeah.
Right, I know you
the
can
form.
sure about how there's different souls, but it sounds like it's just
Different?
souls, but it sounds like there's just one.
What, for different people?
It sounds like no, for animal, one animal
For
soul.
2
The form of
lions?
different
Or
parts.
for lions and zebras?
Well, doesn't sound like, the form of sensory capacity or the form
No, this is metaphysics, depending on how many forms there are in general for every design. There's only one. There's one form for each actual thing in general for everything. But these forms are not separate, so they die when they stop existing and the thing goes away. So they're not very special.
What do you mean the form? Meaning the thing that had the form stopped existing. But what do you mean by
Yeah, a form doesn't exist more than the thing that has it. That's Aristotle's position about forms. Maybe the universal does, but we're not getting into that common. Nobody knows. He says the universal exists in the thing. That's how we usually think.
Yeah, the red and red.
There's not, in general, I don't know. In general, this is basically Aristotle metaphysics. Aristotle metaphysics are that forms are subservient to the things that have forms, and which things are individual substances. So you, Chaim, or I forgot your name, has. Your name is not Chaim, but Chaim means life. So we're talking about Chaim. Anyways, so Mr. Whoever, he has a soul in the sense of, again, I'm not talking about the intellect, which might be immortal and so on, but the Chaim is a form, and that form when he dies goes away, and his body is not even the body of that; it's just something else. Or whatever. Point is that
According to Aristotle, is there a discrete animal soul for every animal, or it's just that there's a notion of an animal soul?
No, this is another question. It sort of depends. He talks about this question and doesn't give an answer. I didn't see the answer. I don't know. There is, but it's not different enough. In other words, we're talking about now. Right now we're talking about the general definition in the sense that worms and humans are the same. They might not actually be the same because maybe there's another thing that makes them different. Like, humans are small, humans are bigger, whatever. There's something different in humans. Forget about humans, dogs and worms are different. But for what, the sense of the animal soul being the sensitive soul, then they're the same thing. Worms and dogs are the same thing. They're both sense. And they also both have feelings and wants of that as well. So not only that, because sensing implies that and whatever that. So not only your dog has wants and likes, and worms also do that. Because obviously they do, because they go towards the food and they run away from things that bother them. So that's basic. He goes with imagination and want and will and so on. But I have to finish one thing. So these are the two ways. So this seems what I know. Now I could think of this is like in spatial separation. So this is I think how we end up there being. I just need to do one more thing that I thought of, and I guess I can stop after that, which is that. So this is about like actually cutting something up. Okay. Now forget about actually cutting something up. Let's say we obviously can't do this. We already figured out what happens when you actually cut something up with a knife. What about cutting it up with my metaphysical knife, right? Right, there's a lot of ways of doing that. Conceptually cutting up, right? Forget about it being different, cuttable, like we discussed the difference between being conceptually cutting up, being separable, called it in mind or in thought, having different times about it, all that, and being separable in action, right, in the actual thing. So, but now conceptually being cut up, so now there's also an interesting question, right? So assuming that a person has two kinds of parts, as we discussed. Even the actual organs that we have, right? I have a right hand and a left hand, right? These are separate by virtue of being in different space, or you can even say like being a part of different matter. Whether my right hand is made out of a different piece of flesh or whatever than my left hand. Okay. Besides for that, my right hand has a different meaning than my left hand, right? It has a different form, right? It has a different function. Well, right hand and left hand don't have such different functions, but they still have some different function, right? I'm right-handed, so I do certain things on my right hand, and my left hand is just helping it or whatever. It has a different function. So when I talk about right hand and left hand, I talk about two different ways in which they're together or secrete or not together, right? Either they're, like I talk about them being the same, but they're obviously not literally made out of the same flesh, but we just discussed what happened in that sense. But they're also conceptually different, right? But they're also conceptually the same, right? They have some connection conceptually. So we need to have a good hierarchy or a good separation of different ways in which they can be separate and different, the different faculties, the different things of anything, really. Right? So the basic two things that I understood to explain what he's doing is that we can think of two things. I'm not thinking right now by my right hand and my left hand. I have to think how distinct they are conceptually. Because my right hand is the right hand of, and my left hand is left hand of, and you can't really be the left hand without being the right hand existing. So they have some kind of connection. They might have a two-way connection. I have to think. I don't know. But thinking about the things that he thinks about, you end up with something like two things. I thought of it in my own example. So take something like talking. Okay, you can talk and you can sing. Okay, that's some people, not everyone. Most people can talk, not everyone can sing. Maybe everyone can sing, but not very well. So whatever. Point is, these are two different things. They're both done by the same instrument. Okay, they're both done by the same piece of matter, right? You've got vocal cords, or whatever it is, the ear getting pushed through your mouth and whatever. That causes sound. Okay, speech is a little more complicated, but it causes sound and splits. Okay, but they're both done by the same thing, right? So they're not separable. This is a better example of sort of that something is different in concept and definition, but not different in matter, right? Singing and talking is done by the same exact piece of flesh. Well, if you a little more complicated, you might say that they are different parts of the brain, but okay. But let's assume they're part of when it's actually getting done, not where it's getting planned out. Okay, they're done by the same instrument, but they're two different things. So they're totally different. Someone can be able to speak without being able to sing. Okay, but there's something interesting. Well, I think speech is different. I should say voice, like being able to make noise, being able to make any words already. Another thing, a little more complicated than that. right? But this, if you think about this, you see that these two things are separable only one way. It's interesting, right? It doesn't look like, I think so, at least that's what I thought this afternoon. It doesn't look like you could sing without being able to talk or without being able to make noise. You can't have that ability. Again, in your brain, I don't know, but in your vocal cords, you can't have that ability. Everyone that can sing can also talk. I think generally. A lot of people can sing and can't talk anything sensible. That's a different problem. But anyone that can sing can also make noise with his vocal cords, okay? And make sound. Right? Because singing implies that. So the power of singing, and I'm not even talking about the vocal cords, the power of singing, the faculty of singing, the concept of singing implies the concept of noise making or talking maybe. But not vice versa, right? The concept of talking doesn't apply to singing. Many people can talk, and maybe some people literally can't sing, like he doesn't know how to make a tone, not even sing badly, can't sing at all. Seems at least possible.
Right.
I know some such people, right? No, they think they can sing, that's another problem. So things like these things so this is one kind of like connecting two things. These two things, they're connected somehow, but not connected somehow. So in other words, you would say it's necessary for singing to go on to have voice going on. It's not sufficient, right? It's another thing, right? But it's not necessary, right? But it's not vice versa, right? You can't have singing without talking. You could have talking without singing. Because talking can be sufficient in itself, and singing not. So singing is sort of, if you think about it like this, singing is sort of a parasite on talking. Okay. It needs that to exist. And so these two things are separable in different ways. Right? Like if we think about the form, not even thinking about the right? If someone says there's a soul or some cause of being able to sing, which would be a soul or kind of a part of a soul or whatever, that part would have an independent existence, but the part of singing would be contingent on the part of talking. It would be only so you could have it would be separable only one way. Right? Which would mean that in some way this talking would be more basic or more definitive of whatever this thing is that we're talking about. If that makes sense. Or you could have a very simple thing, right? Singing and running are two things that have nothing to do with each other. We could think of two things that use the same thing, right? Could I think of two things that use the same thing? I wrote it down. What was my other example? I was saying, just in mind. Try to think if there's something that. Let's say two kinds of singing. That was my example. If you take, let's say, someone can sing opera and another person can sing rock or whatever. Assuming that these things have nothing to do with each other, I don't know. But let's say these two styles of singing have nothing to do, and they act. They're not just like different things that each do. There's something that you need to learn. There's some kind of chachma. There's something that you go to school for them. These two things are not related. They're just two separate things. You might have both. You might have one of them. You might have neither of them. But they're two separate things. These are totally two separate powers. They have nothing to do with each other. There are two different ways in which things can conceptually be different or the same. They can be conceptually different where one needs each other, at least two things can need each other both ways. They can not exist without each other, they can exist only one without the other, and the other can exist without that, which should make that one more basic. Or they can totally exist separately and have nothing to do with each other. And then you can cut them up. Well, you might not be able to cut them up with a knife, but you can cut them up in your mind. And this is sort of what he's going to do with this connection between nutrition and other things. The first thing he's going to do, right? He's going to claim that the connection between Aristotle's thing is to say that the connection between what we call different levels of an animal or a human. So an animal is both a plant and an animal. They're not separate in the way that singing opera is separate from singing rock songs, but they're separate in the way that singing is separate from talking, from sound. In other words, you understand? Right. That's the end of my sheet. Sorry, no, I think it's
at the end of the last part, then my notes are.
But I think that I thought of a way that makes sense for myself without reading words and saying other people's language.